Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for those who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of your life. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. In May of 2012, Tim Larkin was checking into his international flight at the Las Vegas airport. He was on his way to London to speak at a personal defense seminar when he received some pretty incredible news. The attendant at the check-in counter handed his passport back and let him know that he had been banned from entering Britain by Interior Minister Theresa May. Why? Well, it turns out that riots had broken out across the country a few months before, which had increased demand for Tim's specific set of skills. You see, Tim Larkin is commonly regarded as the world's foremost authority on personal defense. He's trained military special forces, law enforcement, and high-profile clients like Tony Robbins how to defend themselves when faced with a violent encounter. Well, the truth of the matter is that unless you're in the business of war or law enforcement, very few of us expect to get into a situation where our lives are being threatened by another individual. And yet, we have no control over that eventuality. It's a choice that someone else has made, and now we have to deal with the consequences. If someone decides to threaten you, all you can do is respond. But do you know how? Would you know what to do if somebody came up to your car window with a weapon? Or if they pulled a gun on you and demanded your belongings? Or if they entered your home at night while you and your family were asleep? Well, chances are extremely high that you'd have no idea, which assures you that you'd end up in the victim category from the very first moment. Well, today, Tim is going to teach you how to change the equation and how to take control of your personal safety once and for all in a fantastic and fascinating interview. So please help me welcome Tim Larkin. Well, Tim Larkin, welcome to Self-Made Man. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. You and I have a ton of mutual friends, and I've seen your work for years and years now, and so I'm really thrilled to finally have you here on the show. And I'm even more excited about the fact that we're going to be discussing a topic that we have not discussed here on the podcast in nearly 3 years, which is really, self-defense. How do you protect yourself if something unexpected happens? And I love the title of your most recent book, which really sums it up, and the talk that you did at Google, which is When Violence is the Answer. And I just think that's awesome because today, specifically, over the last year or two, we've seen such a massive news cycle and propaganda cycle when it comes to self-defense, specifically in Europe, but also here in the United States. And there's almost like this agenda, if you will, against reality. And I know you have some good stories and analogies around that as well, but before we dive into that, I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about your story and specifically how you became one of the world's foremost experts on self-defense.
Yeah, it just as an overriding theme for everybody, I basically live in the entrepreneur community. In addition to what I do, I'm a practitioner, I'm a master close combat trainer. I've trained, literally just about every sort of military or law enforcement elite group you can think of, a lot of celebrities and people like that. But the main reason somebody would want to listen to this, and it's kind of unique for an entrepreneurial group to actually have a call on self-protection and self-defense, is because there is nothing, just trust me, there's nothing that can change your world faster than an act of violence. And I've seen some of the best people in the world, some of the most successful people in the world, unfortunately, get reminded that we still live in this physical world. I think there's with all the great technology that we have right now and all the things we have access to. Doing a podcast like this, just the fact to share information on so many different subjects, it's just an incredible time. But what I find is the other side of that is the fact that often we forget, that we do live in a physical world, and that, a little bit of knowledge can go a long way to minimizing the chance of violence ever coming into your life. My background is I was a Navy brat. My dad was a officer in the Navy, and we moved all around. I had an interest in combat sports since an early kid. My grandfather was a big proponent of combat sports. Specifically, he loved boxing, taught us boxing as we were young kids. But the idea for me was it was always something that it was expected. It was expected that specifically the young men in our family would all be able to protect themselves and know the basics of it, understand, how to use, I use the term violence, but how to use violence to protect yourself, not to initiate it, not to be criminal in its use, but it was just one of these things that it was a basic rite of passage that you were expected to be able to, handle yourself. And we've kind of lost that. We've outsourced that basically in the last 50 years for very well-meaning reasons. We've got to the point to where even looking at the subject of violence is controversial because we've associated and stigmatized the word violence to mean criminal. And so oftentimes people say, well, I don't want to be a criminal, therefore I don't want to learn anything about this. I want to learn the anti-violence, method, or I want to use something that makes me feel more comfortable with the term, rather than to say, when you look at violence, you have to look at it as the same way we look at any other tool that we use. It is merely a tool. How you use the tool will be determined on whether or not it was a justified use of the tool, which is going to be, reckoned to be self-defense, or criminal use of the tool, where you're going to have to deal with the justice system. So, the tool itself, it does not make you criminal, and knowing how to effectively wield the tool does not make you criminal. And so I just want to up front kind of set the stage that way. That's how it was always explained to me as a young kid. Well, I never went looking for a fight or anything like that, but I had no problem recognizing when I might have to protect myself. Take that through my years of being a Navy kid and going to all these different, cities in the United States and abroad, living on all the various bases. I was exposed to a lot of combat sports and martial arts. Usually wherever I went, there was a Marine base, and the Marines usually were the ones that were teaching some form of martial arts to any of the kids on base. So I was very comfortable, with that and loved it, to the point to where when I got to San Diego, my father's last command was in San Diego, and we lived in Coronado, California, on the base in Coronado, California. And right across the street, literally the chain link fence to my backyard looked out on the highway, and across the highway, I saw Basic Underwater Demolition School, which is where the SEALs train. And it was their obstacle course was out back. And my brother and I, I was 12 and my brother was 10 at the time. And we just decided, they must have built this for us. This is our own personal playground. And so we would, go across the street and we would play on the obstacle course, and of course get kicked off by these really just cool looking guys that were running around with, these trainees. And they were just basically getting these trainees to do everything. It was just really entertaining as a young kid to watch these guys, run in the water, dunk themselves in the water, roll around in the sand, get yelled at, have to do calisthenics. It was just great entertainment if you were a kid, having no idea at the point that this was, the trainees that were trying to become part of the SEAL teams during that time. And I got fascinated there was a job like that. So I decided very early on that's what I wanted to do. Fast forward, I get to college. I still, stay with that. I'm in ROTC. I'm doing extremely well in my ROTC studies, to the point to where I was able to get one of 2 slots that year to become an officer in the SEAL teams, at least get the opportunity to go to training. And I did really well in that. I was basically bigger, faster, stronger. I'd been preparing for it since I was 12 years old. I knew everything about training because my SEAL friends that I met told me everything. And so I had this really unfair advantage that I was able to pass on to my boat group. And we won a lot of the big events. We won Hell Week, which is a 5-day event where they keep you up, for 5 days. It's probably the most well-known event in SEAL training. And the long swims, everything that we had to do out at with weapons and explosives, I flew through all of that. I had about 2 weeks before I was to go to my command. I had already picked to go to SEAL Team 4, which back then was the big place to go. If any of you guys are watching the Netflix show Narcos, where they're doing all the counter-narcotics work, that's heavily what the SEAL teams were involved in. SEAL Team 4 was involved in, and that was the place everybody wanted to go back then because they were getting all the counter-narcotics work. So I had my whole life planned out for me, and everything was just fantastic, and I was arrogant about it. Like I said, I was at the height of my physical prowess back then. And then something happened to me. I went on something that should have been just a very easy dive. I was a little bit congested. I had a head cold. I could have opted to take the dive later, but that would have required me to give up a weekend. And of course, I had important things to do on the weekend. I had dates to go on. I had beer to drink. It was, I wasn't going to do that. So I figured I'd just gut it out with my head cold and get past this dive. I was down tying on explosives to an obstacle we were doing breath holding, and a wave of water, waves go on the top of the surface and they go on the bottom of the surface. A wave of water hit my ear just perfectly, my very congested, ear, and burst my eardrum, sent water, cold seawater up in the middle of my skull, emptied out. And as soon as it emptied out, meaning all the warm fluid went out of the middle of my head, that's what it felt like. It was the semicircular canal fluid going out of me, which, allows you to have balance basically. And I went into a vertigo where I had no idea which way was up. Was able to get myself to the surface by pulling myself up on a tow line of the boat that was above me. They said when my head hit the floor, the surface, that it was slapping uncontrollably. I was bleeding out of both ears. They pulled me on. Here I was, literally the guy that was going to be the honor man of this class. The honor man's like the number one guy in your class. I was going to the team I wanted to go. And I knew in that boat, there was a very good corpsman. A corpsman is a medically trained enlisted guy who's just, most of these guys are just amazing. And he quickly looked in my ear with his scope. And I could tell, because I knew him fairly well, and I could tell just by his reaction that I was done. I knew that my ears were just done. And so here I was. My whole life was being planned. It was the first time I ever got introduced to true injury to the human body, where I couldn't gut it out. I couldn't just truly, tough it out or just shake it off or anything. I mean, I'd been hit before. I'd had ribs cracked. I had all sorts of non-specific trauma, but I never had true injury to the human body where basically your body betrays the brain. The brain says, hey, I want you to do this. And then your body's just saying, sorry, you're shut down right now. And what I thought was going to be literally the end of my life. I mean, at 21, that's how you think. It ended up being the most seminal stage, probably when I look back in my life. That one event set me on my path to really, redefine the way people look at self-protection. And it's really through that injury to the human body, because what I found out about injury to the human body is that it bypasses bigger, faster, and stronger. And that was really kind of key, because up until then, especially I was a kid of the 80s and early 90s. And of course, that was the height of physical, bodybuilding, profound. I mean, our heroes were guys like, Schwarzenegger and, the Rambo movies with Stallone, and, physical fitness was huge back then. And of course, being, trying to be a SEAL trainee, going there, we were very, very physical. And so we focused on bigger, faster, stronger. But what I found out very quickly was, if you flip that, and instead of looking at the differences in the human body, we focus on the similarities that we all have, and the similar weaknesses that we have in there, that you kind of unlock a Rosetta Stone to self-protection, where it doesn't matter if the threat is bigger, faster, and stronger. And that was kind of the first inception, for me, of that kind of thinking. It's led to 30 years of training people and organizations that I never could have imagined at the time, in a very specific set of skills. And that's basically how to take really good data, and the data that we get on injury is from sports injury data. And that's basically humans colliding with humans colliding with the ground. And the reason you want to look at injuries from that type of data is because that is what you and I as humans can replicate. We can replicate those forces. A lot of times you'll see injury data on human beings, and it's from mechanical devices, a car crash, or, a pneumatic press, or something that you and I, can't create those kind of forces. But when you look at the sports injury data, you see the same areas of the human body. There's approximately 70 of them, coming up over and over again. It ends up allowing you a template on how to, protect yourself in a very different manner. I very quickly found out there's a real difference between competition and destruction. And that was probably, now looking at it in my life, it was probably the most important lesson I could have learned. Of course, back then I thought it was, the end of any chance that I ever had of doing any kind of work that I was interested in doing in the special operations community.
Can you share with us some stories that you've come across in your years as you started down the path, when it comes to teaching self-defense, and maybe some of your clients? I'm sure you've got hundreds of instances where someone is all of a sudden subjected to violence for the very first time. It changes their life. It changes their mindset. They get a hold of you. What are some of those stories that have really stuck out with you over the years?
Well, I'll try to give you two things on opposite ends of the spectrum that'll relate to the audience that we have right now. I work a lot. As we said at the beginning, we know a lot of the same people, and of course, a lot of the same organizations. And I've presented to a lot of entrepreneurial groups, literally around the globe. Some of the bigger ones are groups like Young Presidents Organization or EO, and all their chapters all around the world. And you end up, getting privy to, some pretty interesting people, but also people that have a real familiarity with the potentiality for violence. And what's interesting is the difference between the U.S. members and then the international members. I specifically remember doing a huge event in Prague in the early 2000s for YPO, and it was probably one of their biggest events they had, and they literally had people from all over the world attending this. It was one of the best attended ones at that time, and they were very excited, and they wanted to build more international membership. And so I remember the marketing girl, and she was very sweet, but I was sitting in a group where it was the King of Jordan, another high sheikh from Saudi Arabia. We had members of South America. It was a really eclectic group that we were all sitting around, but I probably was one of the few Americans in the group. And when she came here, she was trying to pitch everybody on the idea of letting YPO do an expose on themselves and their families and, their backgrounds, and be able to print it and send it out, as recruiting, data that literally would go, in open source. And she was shocked how quickly she got shut down by the majority of these people, because they live in a world that, you don't do anything to draw attention to yourself that way. If anything, you play down everything because of the very real threat they had to deal with at that time with kidnapping or some sort of a, violent event, depending on where they lived in the world. And it was very interesting to see that. Probably one of the things that stuck out for me during that time was there was a very arrogant guy there. He was an American. He owned a company, and he was very, very successful at the time, but he was very boisterous during the whole event. And he was annoying a lot of people. I remember he was just he was your typical ugly American, if you think about it. And apparently he came to my training, and he mellowed out a little bit during my presentation. He didn't give me any problems, but he didn't really listen. I remember he ended up leaving. There were a lot of other events he did. I remember he ended up leaving midway through my presentation. And I come to find out, I think it was 6 months later, he goes to the Turks and Caicos, a very, very exclusive resort that's there. And he had a very remote bungalow that was literally on the end of the resort on the water, very secluded. And apparently he's a very successful guy, very used to getting his own way. And he was there with his mistress. And he apparently was incredibly rude to the staff and abusive, was very much flaunting jewelry that he bought her, and, having her prance around with a lot of it, and just kind of throwing his lifestyle in everybody's face during that time. And ended up, I remember it shook all of YPO, that his bungalow, he ended up getting attacked. 5 guys came in. They not only beat him to within an inch of his life, but they were demanding that they got the jewelry and everything. They knew everything. And, he sat there and they sexually assaulted his mistress in front of him. And it was just a huge, huge issue. It had never happened before at this particular resort. It's a very much 5-star resort. It truly, when they found out everything, it was solely predicated on this guy's bad behavior, that his behavior was so obnoxious that the staff started telling, some of their family members and outlying family members. And there's obviously in everybody kind of realizes that in the Caribbean, for the most part, there's a huge criminal element, and they saw opportunity, and they also had no problem turning this guy over because he was so abusive. And it didn't necessarily surprise anybody, but it literally, the next time I saw this guy, he was a shell of his former self. And to me, it's just kind of the cardinal rule lesson. I train self-protection literally all over the world. I've trained everything from the most elite counter-terrorist guys to, really, really well-known celebrities. And I'll tell you that the number one thing that people come away with is the more you understand how to use the tool of violence, the much less likely you are to ever have behaviors that would ever unnecessarily bring it upon you. You understand that. And that's probably the greatest thing that I can do for people is behavior modification. And oftentimes, especially with my entrepreneur clients, a lot of what makes us successful, being good negotiators and being aggressive and doing all that in the business world can be fantastic for us there, but it can be absolutely lethal for us if we apply some of those communication skills in the wrong areas, because people just don't respond. People sit there wishing the world is a certain way and think they should be able to do and speak in a manner that they want to speak, and quickly find out that, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily operate that way.
Yeah, that's something that I find incredibly interesting, is that there seems to be two categories of people in the world. And I think this literally is the way that their brain is wired. I don't really think that they have a choice in the matter. I see one group as viewing the world from an idealistic point of view. Here's how things should be. And these are folks that, that's not fair. This is more fair. If there's violence or whatever, somebody gets shot, well, then take away all the guns because we shouldn't need guns. We shouldn't have guns. And then there's the other group who views the world from a very realistic standpoint, and the fact that no matter how much you wish the world was a certain way, that's dependent upon both parties and all other people out there feeling the same way. And Mother Nature has this crazy little, part about it, in the fact that it wants balance. And there's always going to be an opposing side to every view in order to achieve that balance, because if everybody thought the same way, there would be no balance, right? So if you're a nice guy, that means there's going to be a violent guy to balance you out. And having that epiphany, I think, for a lot of people, it just escapes them for some odd reason. And I don't know if you've noticed that as well or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably I think it comes down to the fact that we've got away from, when I grew up, I mean, I'm a little bit older, so we still have, like in my high school, we would have Irish fight night, and I went to all boys Catholic high school in San Diego, and if you had an issue, you could literally put on the gloves with another guy, and you could have a physical outlet for that. And I think we've repressed. You got to hear me through on this. I'm not advocating that that's what has to happen, but there was much more a realization that things could devolve into the physical. And I think we've lost that. I think we are under the illusion, now that, the threat, especially in the U.S., I hear this all the time, the idea that the almighty lawsuit is going to protect us from physical violence is really just strange. I mean, it's a much better approach to life is to really understand the tool of violence, understand how it gets triggered, and then understand how to minimize it, for your life. Because, in my trainings, if people come to train with me, they're going to learn how to physically tear apart the human body. They're going to learn how to do it for the sole purpose of saving their life. It has nothing to do with competition. It has only to do with destruction. And when people realize if they ignore all the signs to either get out of a place or disengage or choose to push a situation that is easily avoidable, that if they have to use physical violence to protect themselves, they quickly learn that they'll lose control of what the outcome is. We have no idea once we cross the physical plane on another human being where that's going to end up. I give the example of, say a guy's like a loudmouth at an event. Maybe maybe it's a wedding and he's got drunk and he's just, he's a big guy, looks like Schwarzenegger in his prime, but he's just being obnoxious, groping people and just knocking people around and, to the point to where he's really getting annoying. And so, you have been asked by, the best man or somebody, hey, can you calm that guy down? So you look at him and you say, you know what, this guy's just a big oaf and he's not listening to anybody. I got to teach him a quick lesson. So I think I'll hit him to the solar plexus Solar plexus is basically in the middle of the gut. And all things being equal, it'll take his air from him. It'll take the fight out of him, won't quote unquote kill him. And, I can basically be the hero here. And so you go up and you give him a quick elbow into the solar plexus. You go to wrap under him to take him out of the event, get him out of there. All of a sudden, he just clutches his chest. He starts to turn purple. He drops on the ground. What you didn't know is, even though the guy looks like he's in amazing shape, he has a genetically bad heart. And you've just triggered an arrhythmia now. And now he's sitting there dying of a heart attack. And, now you're looking at manslaughter, and you're going to have to deal with this over something that never had to be handled that way. You chose to respond with violence, and you thought it was going to go a certain way. And yet once you cross that physical plane, because there are too many unknowns, you know nothing about the other person. Now you end up, in that situation. So that's the bad side. And the reason I talk about this is because what's fascinating to me is the more I study the subject and the more I got into the general population, civilian population world versus military and law enforcement, I was amazed by how many people would try to provoke violence. In areas, it seems like everybody wants to use violence when it's unnecessary. And yet when it is necessary, that's when everybody wants to talk. And it's just really funny. So putting the book together, it was really, it's a theme that's been very, very prevalent in my 30 years of doing this, that the biggest question people have to me is not when not to do violence. We all pretty much know that. But when would it ever be appropriate to respond to a situation with violence? And I found by giving people that education, they really are appreciative of that. And it really gives them a really good way to, guide all of the way they respond to situations.
Can you take us through some of the kind of the most important basics that would be useful to people who are listening to this?
Yeah, people, people would love to get, you'll have other guys in my industry and they'll basically give them platitudes on some things. So they'll say, hey, hit here, here, and here, and this will serve you each and every time. I just know that's just irresponsible to do anything like that. That's not, violence doesn't happen in a pre-formatted way. If anything, in the 30 years I've been doing this, when things have happened to my clients, it's always in a way I never would have imagined for them. And therefore, what you need is you need really to understand really good principles. And probably one of the first principles is, how do I even determine when I would approach violence? And really, it comes down to a very simple concept. It is literally devoid of choice. Meaning, if you had a way of talking your way out of it, you would have done that. If there was an exit to take, you would have taken it. If there's any chance that you could have talked your way out of this, you would have absolutely done that by now. But what you're facing is imminent grievous bodily harm that if you don't take action, you are going to basically be participating in your own murder. And the threat is such that if the caveat I put on is, if I had a firearm, I would feel justified in emptying that firearm into the threat. So that's the level that I would we'd even consider when we use the tool of violence. And that makes it very easy to dismiss everything else. And, some of that is all ego. You got your ego in control because people are going to be rude and people are going to be obnoxious. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to play that game, because that game can go down the wrong road and get you involved in an act of violence that you really don't want to be part of. Because we have no idea what the other person is capable of, and we have no idea what their story is. I say this to people all the time. They'll talk about, if a knife was to your throat and he was gonna, he asked you for his watch and his wallet, and you give him the watch and the wallet, then what would happen? What would you do? Well, yeah, I'd take the watch and wallet and I'd leave. I'd go, great. When was the last time you put a knife to somebody's throat? And they go, well, never. And so, so you have no idea what that person's capable of doing or what they're doing. You can't treat things like it's some sort of a negotiation. You have no idea what the other side is up to. And that's probably the biggest gift that I give to people, is that ability to make the distinguish between antisocial aggression. And antisocial aggression is what a lot of us equivocate and we think violence is. And that is just unpleasant communication. That's, people knocking into you, people being rude to you, people cutting you off on the street in your car, all of the minor annoyances that are basically generated through somebody being rude or making rude comments and thinking that we have to participate in it. Whereas, the asocial act of violence is imminent. It's going to happen. And your only chance of surviving this is to effectively use the tool against a threat. And once you get that crystal clear delineation in people, it's amazing the behavioral changes that happen. I had a guy who was an oilman in West Texas, super successful, comes from a very successful family. He himself was even triple the success of the family. But you could tell, meeting this guy, is a big guy, very capable physically, and you could tell he'd probably like to go to the honky tonks and, get in some fights. He just seemed that guy because he came wanting to learn how to fight better was what he told me when he first came in. After the first day of training, Saturday on Sunday morning, he came and talked to me right before class. He goes, "I just want to thank you." And I said, "What are you thanking me for?" And he said, "Well, I just had a conversation with my wife and I told her she no longer has to worry about me." He said, "Just after yesterday, the first day," he goes, "I realized how lucky I've been that I didn't inadvertently kill somebody that I just chose to get in a fist fight with, just accidentally. And B, that I didn't go up against one of these alpha predators that you talk about that really understand how to use violence." And he said, I just was beating myself up, realizing my behavior was putting me in all these unnecessary situations. And my wife had told me about this before, and I just dismissed it, saying, I had to protect the ego. And it was amazing to see a guy like that make the switch. And I've had numerous people like that who have, once you tell them, hey, you don't have to respond this way anymore. You don't even have to deal with these unpleasant people. You can just disengage, and you have the ability to choose. If there's choice, it's not the time to use violence. And that's, the biggest thing you got to hammer home. And that's why the book is so important in laying that out. And that's what the whole premise was, the idea, because what gets people into trouble is not the punching and the kicking and all of that. That's pretty straightforward. And I train it to people in the most extreme manner. I absolutely am straightforward about it. But the thing that gets people in trouble is not having a clear understanding of when to and when not to use the tool.
I really like that because I don't think it's something that people really consider, right? I'm sure we've all seen, videos online of jiu-jitsu and personal self-defense videos and all kinds of stuff. And that's the first time I've heard of this topic actually brought up, right? You hear a little bit about it when it comes to concealed carry and kind of the mental checklist you go through if you are carrying a firearm and someone's about to attack you, of this little checklist that you can use before you actually pull out your firearm and use it. So this is the equivalent of that, I think, which is really, really cool. One of the questions that I have for you is, how does someone realistically acquire this skill set from someone like yourself, right? Because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of videos on YouTube when it comes to the topic of self-defense, and most of them are technique-based. Here's how to, go after someone who pulls a gun on you or a knife on you, or here's how to get up a chokehold. And at the end of the day, I think the scary part is that watching those videos can give someone the illusion of ability from their armchair, right? When in fact, if they're faced with that in reality, it's not going to be the case. So can you set some expectations on what it actually takes to acquire that?
Well, what's the cool thing about doing, especially with a group like yours, they'll get it really quick. Okay. It's just like, how many new marketing campaigns do we see all the time? How many new, you understand in your business how to apply things, and you can quickly apply, see if a method works for you or not. But what do you really count on? Well, you count on real data for the most part. I know when, I'm looking at something, be it, say, a pay-per-click or a Facebook campaign or something, I look at the hard data on campaigns that have been run. When I'm talking to, we're inundated with new pros all the time that supposedly are going to get you great results. But if you don't know your own information, you're going to be in trouble. So it's the same thing. It's even more important when it comes to violence. It's understanding when and where you'd ever even want to use something like violence. Where would it even fit into your life? And the worst thing you can do is watch training videos. And the reason being is, I'm not saying training videos are bad in and of themselves, but there's no way to judge whether or not something like that would be effective. What I always tell people to do is, fortunately for me and kind of unfortunately for the world, but there's still a lot of really useful knowledge out there. It's uncomfortable knowledge, but it's useful knowledge in that you can watch closed circuit TV of real violence. People getting attacked, people getting murdered, people getting killed. And what you should do is you should educate yourself to look at acts of real violence. And then you can go back if you want to look at the trainings that people are suggesting and just say, okay, does any of this add up? Does this approach go anywhere even near handling a situation, these situations that I keep seeing of people being attacked on the street, or, is the instructor even dealing with any of this kind of information in a realistic way? Or are they doing things where they're canning everything and taking all the outliers out of it? What do I mean by that? A very canned scenario with sweet looking technique makes the instructor look really good. Again, usually throws out all of the outliers. And what are the outliers? What do I assume? What do I assume for any client that I train? Well, I assume that the threat is always going to be bigger, faster, and stronger. It just never, when it's true violence, it's rare that the person is smaller, weaker, and slower. I'm going to assume that. I'm going to assume that they carry weapons. And I'm going to assume for my client, there's going to be more than one predator they have to deal with. That's just reality. That's the baseline reality of what we're looking at. And when you look at things that way, the skill sets that you need are very different than a lot of what you see that's out there. What I talked about at the very beginning, that idea of the Rosetta Stone being injury to the human body. There's a couple of things that are just uncomfortable truths in the self-protection world. And most everything, no matter how good you are, injury trumps technique each and every time. If you get injury to the human body, people say to me all the time, they go, well, hey, your system, how come your system isn't in the UFC or any of these events? I go, it is. It's always in there. And it's undefeated. I said, it's never been awarded the win, but it's ended every competition that it's ever been used in. And it's because it's injury to the human body. I'm being a little, I'm leading people on a little bit and playing with words. Yeah, but it's true. It's absolutely true. If you look at injuries in these competitions, it absolutely stops the competition cold. And the idea of bypassing bigger, faster, and stronger is there. And the other thing, the encouraging thing and scary thing that people have to get their heads wrapped around is not the fact that, people sit there and say, oh, I got to get trained. And yes, I understand what they're saying, but recognize literally the best people in the world at murdering other human beings with their bare hands or improvised tools have zero training in combat sports and martial arts. Zero training. And those guys all reside in the prison systems. It's mainly the gangs, the alpha predators in the very big prison gangs that, people have all heard of, like Aryan Nation and Black Guerrilla Family and Mexican Mafia, Serranos. The top level predators in those organizations are amazing at what they do. But what they all focus on is anatomy of the human body. When you look across the board, I have videos of interviews of these guys. I went in depth. I have a lot of friends in corrections, and they were able to get me some incredible access to interviews that were done with these alpha predators and how they look at the tool of violence. And it's you want to look at these guys, and this is the idea too. I'm taking you in these uncomfortable areas because I've often found the best information comes from the worst people, especially when it comes to to self-protection. And what's interesting is across the board, every one of these groups studies anatomy of the human body. And the reason they do that is because they can't afford to get it wrong. They're extremely focused in what they're doing. And the way they run things, it's interesting from an entrepreneurial standpoint too, to understand that these guys, instead of using what we do, we look at things and we look at cash flow, we look at marketing budgets, we look at things like that. Their whole currency, their ability to get anything done, to have any sort of power, to have any sort of financial success within the penitentiary system is all predicated on the successful use of violence. So their currency is the successful use of violence. And it's a status mobility system for them. And they have to be really good at using the tool. Therefore, they look at it in a very objective way. They don't look at it from a legacy standpoint. They don't look at it from I like to do this, so I do it this way. They just want to know what works and why it works and can it be replicated. And that's what I put a lot into the book is that type of an approach. And, human beings, the reason we're here as a species is because as a species, by far, we are the best species at using the tool of violence. We're really good. And we're not bigger, faster, and stronger. If we had to be the biggest, fastest, and strongest in order to be the top species, it wouldn't be us. I tell people all the time, I joke with people all the time, hey, who wants to jump in a cage with a 65-pound leopard that hasn't eaten in 2 days? It's a 10 by 10 cage, and survive 10 minutes and you'll get $1 million. And of course, everybody laughs because we understand now 65-pound leopard can absolutely tear through the most prepared 275-pound behemoth that you can think of, human that can go in, because they have everything that they need. Their reflexes are much faster, or they're much stronger than us. So how is it? What makes us dangerous? Why are we who we are? We are who we are because of our human brain. The human brain is the ultimate concealed carry, and that's what we have. It allows us to improvise any sort of tools. You alluded earlier to the feel-good measures that are out there every time we have some sort of an act of violence, is to try to outlaw whatever tool was used or control whatever tool was used. And I understand it's well-meaning. It's also easy. It's a very lazy approach because we think the tool is the issue, and the issue is not the tool. What we're trying to get a control of is the intent to do harm, and we can't control intent. We can't do anything to do that. Intent will always be there. Right now, London's dealing with just a huge rash of knife crime, where their murder rate actually was outpacing New York, which is unheard of. But it's been getting very, a lot worse over in the UK because, again, their approach, they're far more concerned about a citizen, law-abiding citizen, having the means to protect themselves than they are about the criminals who already have these illegal means, to protect themselves. They're not going to be bound by laws or any of that kind of stuff.
I was going to ask you if demand for your work has really risen in Europe over the last year.
Well, it's really interesting. My book came out, and I was very proud. The first international rights that were bought was literally within days of my publication. Was Israel bought the first rights. The next day, it was the Russians bought the rights, and that says it all to me. I mean, those are two cultures and countries that really understand violence, and they understand, and where it's at. And I don't mean it from a glorification standpoint. You understand, none of this. The book is not about. The book literally will allow you to live a far more peaceful life. And again, I'm not really shilling for the book. I'm just the topics that we're talking about. If you study violence and you really have a good understanding of it, just like anything else, it takes away all the irrational fear. You understand it. It's kind of like it's why the analogy I like to use is swimming. I have young children right now. I have a 7-year-old, and my twin daughters are 4. And the reason I taught them to swim and continue to have them swim is not to become the next Michael Phelps. The reason I am having them learn how to swim is because I want them to not drown. I want them to be able to protect themselves. And that's kind of the way everybody should look at, the idea of the tool of violence. And people have this strange rationale with learning stuff like this. People will say, well, I think if I focus on learning how to protect myself or violence, I'm going to be bringing violence into my life. And then I'll challenge them by saying, well, I remember literally being in a girl's apartment. It was a friend of mine in New York, and it was a very nice apartment. And I happened to be in the kitchen. She was talking to me, and I just opened up the drawer that was below the stove. And sure enough, by code, there was a little fire extinguisher. And I said, well, you got a fire extinguisher? And she said, well, yes, I got a fire extinguisher. She goes, we have to by code. I go, you know how to use it? She goes, yeah. I go, well, obviously you're going to be bringing fire into your life if you know how to use that. And she kind of looked at me for a minute. I said, what does it really provide you? It provides you that peace of mind that should there be a fire, you know where the equipment is, you know how to use the equipment. And until there's any need for that, you can go about enjoying your life. And I said, it's the same thing about when you learn how to protect yourself. You understand how violence works, what the parameters are. The scary part for most people is not the fact that when they get trained properly, they come away not uncomfortable in the fact that they're worried about violence necessarily being done to them. The uncomfortable fact for them when they're presented the information in the correct manner is they quickly realize they were already pre-wired. They already knew how to do a lot of this. All I do is I just kind of provide the roadmap for them, and they realize, hey, I'm already pretty good at this, because it has nothing to do with, physical ability. It doesn't have you don't have to be able to be some world-class athlete to be able to use the tool of violence. I equivocate it to the idea of, combat sports and martial arts at the highest levels. And I live in Las Vegas. I'm based out of Las Vegas. And so a lot of my friends are high level, combat sport practitioners, great guys and just amazing athletes. But they're the equivalent of, the idea of just a very small portion of those physical elites can get in those competitions. And I tell people all the time, that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is the idea of competition versus destruction. Competition is the idea that if I brought a huge block of Italian marble in to a room and say there was like 40 of us in there, and I said, okay, guys, here's a master chisel set. We're not leaving here till you produce Michelangelo's David. Probably nobody in the room could come anywhere close to some approximation of that, unless we were extremely lucky and had some, fine arts student that was, semi-capable. He probably could do something, but nothing close to what, Michelangelo is. And that's how I equivocate combat sport athletes. Their ability to rise through the ranks and compete at that level is just a rarity. I mean, it really is. Now, in that same scenario, if instead of the master chisel set, I came in with a bunch of sledgehammers and I told everybody, hey, nobody goes to lunch until this block is reduced to rubble, they could all swing a sledgehammer and just, break that into rubble. Everybody's capable of doing that. There's no skill set involved in that. It's just pure destruction. And we can implement that. And that's what real self-protection is. Real self-protection is just learning the skill sets of destruction, which are accessible to everybody. If you can think and move, you can protect yourself. And what I mean by that is not in the traditional way that a lot of people think. Oftentimes when we think of self-protection or something, we imagine the duel, the two people that square off, and we always, and that's our imagination. It's sane, socialized human beings. That's what most of us, think of. And that's just not the case. The only way, you can have a competition, a combat sport competition, is you have to outlaw injury to the human body, because there's no place for it. The last time I looked at the rules, there were 31 rules for the UFC. 27 of those rules were outlawing direct injury to the human body. And rightfully so, because the goal is not to maim, cripple, and kill when I get into a sporting contest with my opponent. I want to better my opponent. I want to be the better practitioner. Therefore, I want to show off my athletic skill sets, and we're going to agree not to go into these highly vulnerable areas of the human body so we can have a great competition. But the reality is that when we get outside of that world and we're in the world of violence, oftentimes you'll see these professional fighters do no better than anybody else when it comes to somebody who just wants to use violence against them. I've got numerous videos of highly trained combat sport practitioners, being taken out by regular people. They just don't understand that these guys are here just to do violence. They're not there to compete. And it's outside of it's an outlier that they haven't trained for the most part. It doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't say they're not, amazing athletes and amazing individuals. It's just violence is very, very straightforward. And, combat sports is a very indirect path to using violence. You can get some results, but it's not designed to directly access injury to the human body, which is what all the predators, when I was talking about those alphas that we studied in the prison systems, those guys are just only interested in injury to the human body, because it quickly changes everything in your favor. You don't get to find out how good a jiu-jitsu practitioner somebody is if you can knock them out. if you can cause a concussion, if you can crush their throat, if you can break their ankle, if you can systemically change their brain through injury and get it to basically get the body to betray the brain to where they have to completely solely focus on one area of the human body, it doesn't matter how big, fast, and strong they are. And I have numerous clients, unfortunately, over the years that have had to use this, and they're very unlikely people up against much bigger, faster, and stronger individuals who felt that they were not a threat. They saw them as a victim. They saw them as, being able to let their guard down, get in close, maybe try to use some sort of intimidation tactic by pulling them in close. And all that did was bring the vulnerable areas of their body very close to my client. And my client knew how to exploit one of those areas to start the injury process. and it's, it's the idea of, as soon as people grab on to one of my clients, I want them to think, oh no, you've just entered a bear trap. And now, now my person knows exactly what to do, and they know exactly where to go in such a situation like that.
That's cool. That's a really empowering way to reframe an experience like that would traditionally be, horrific. So that's cool. Well, Tim, I want to be conscious of your time. I know it's incredibly valuable, and you've been really gracious to join us here today. I feel like we've just scratched the surface on this topic, and obviously this is important for everybody to really educate themselves on. You do have the new book that just recently came out. Where should people go to pick up a copy of that?
Best place to go is you can get it anywhere. You can get it, Barnes and Noble. You can get it at Amazon. But if you go to, I've set up a landing page, whenviolenceistheanswer.com. It's where the book is. The reason to go there and buy the book is because right there is the only place you can register and get free. There's 10 chapters to the book, and I did 10 videos to supplement it. There's over 2,000 pages that I had to whittle down to a couple hundred pages for this book. So there's a lot of extra information. And so I go in depth with these 10 videos that supplement the book. And it's my thank you to anybody that supports the book, because, they've kept me on this one. I've been on the New York Times for every book that I've ever done, and they've kept me off on this one specifically because I fought for the name, the word violence to be in the title, and everybody's uncomfortable with it. And even though, we're out selling a lot of those people, it's support like that is great. And so what I wanted to do for anybody that helps me get the word out like that, I would like to give back and give them a really great video series that, it does a lot of things that we talked about during this call. I use videos, I use real violence videos, I use interviews from the prisoners that I saw. It's just a really great rounding out, and really kind of brings to life a lot of what is written in the book. And I just would like any of your people to be able to take advantage of that, and get that. There's no additional cost. There's nothing, it's just the only way I can get it to you, because Amazon won't let me put that up on their link. And my publisher on this first printing wouldn't let me put it in the book so people can find it. So the only way you can get it right now is if you go to whenviolenceistheanswer.com.
Cool. That's awesome. And also, I want to ask, for those who are listening who'd like to go through one of your workshops or do some training with you in person, what's the best way to connect with you about that?
Best way is to just get on our list, my email list, and you can do it at targetfocustraining.com, or you can do it at timlarkin.com. Either one of those will get you there. And that will make you aware of all of our trainings. Also, I put out a lot of free content. I'm posting a lot. I'm just starting to post a lot on Medium now. And so there's a lot of content that I post at all those places that if you get on the list, you'll make sure not to miss anything.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Tim Larkin, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an amazing conversation. You're one of the best in the world at what you do. So it was a real honor to have you here today. And thank you again for your contribution. This has been awesome.
You got it, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity to share it with your audience.
Absolutely. And guys, as always, thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week. Take care.